Hey everyone, welcome to our Sustainable Solutions panel discussion. My name is M.A. Thomas and I'm the Director of the Environment Program, and I wanted to start off just by welcoming you and thanking you for coming. This is a panel that was completely put together by students and hosted by students, from the topic to the discussants to everything involved. So thank you to Sga Sustainability gurus over here, Tyler Sanchez and Stephanie Oblina, for putting this together. We are being streamed on our YouTube channel, and you can just search YouTube, Loyola University of New Orleans Environment Program, and that's how you can find this for future reference, or share it with your friends right now, put it on social media. They can pick it up right now and watch this great discussion we're about to have. So I also wanted to just quickly make sure that y'all know we have events throughout the week, all the way through Friday evening. So our poster is over here with the dates and the times and the event. And then the details are on our website. If you just click on that QR code, you can get a lot of details. Thanks. Enjoy. Help yourselves with popcorn. Thank you, Curry, for setting this up.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Dr. Thomas said, my name is Tyler Sanchez, and I'm the Student Government Association Vice President. And today I'm joined by Stephanie Oblina, one of our amazing senators at large and chairwoman of the Sga Sustainability Committee. And just to give you all a little information on the Sustainability Committee, it is a committee that we recently reactivated within student government after, noticing that sustainability and environmentalism broadly were key topics on our campus in ways that students can get involved, so that we can build a more knowledgeable community around those issues. So. Okay, well, we'll go right ahead and introduce our panelists for today. Starting out with Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Southwestern Louisiana with graduate degrees from Texas A&M University, and he was a postdoctoral fellow at LSU Medical Center. He taught informal environmental courses focused on nature center education and administration at Texas A&M, and has served as an adjunct professor at the University of New Orleans, LSU, and Tulane University. Before becoming a professor at Loyola, Bob served for 16 years as founding director of the Louisiana Nature Center. He worked with a team of Louisiana nature lovers to found the Louisiana Master Naturalist Program. Dr. Bob holds the Louisiana Distinguished Scholar Chair in Environmental Communication and is Professor of Communication and Design, Director of the Center for Environmental Communication and Department of the Strategic Communication of Loyola University, New Orleans.
Yes, and then in the middle here we have Dr. McClellan. Dr. Joel McClellan is Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Affiliate Faculty in the Environment Program. He is also a returned Peace Corps volunteer and worked in the Community Environmental Program in Panama. Dr. McClellan has taught the following courses related to environmental studies: environmental ethics, environmental philosophy, animal rights theory, and sustainability and intergenerational justice. He will be teaching a climate justice seminar in fall 2020. His primary areas of research are environmental ethics and animal ethics. His most recent publication is Another Dam Controversy, the case of the Cuyahoga from the world's most toxic river to EPA poster child. In Environmental Ethics in the Midwest, Interdisciplinary Approaches, which will come out in December of 2022 with Michigan State University Press.
Moving to our last panelist, Dr. Christian Bolden. Dr. Bolden is the Robert Hunter Distinguished Professor in Criminology and Justice at Loyola University, New Orleans. He earned his PhD in sociology from the University of Central Florida. His recent book, Out of the Red, My Life of Gangs, Prison and Redemption, published by, received the 2020 Frank Tannenbaum Outstanding Book Award from the American Society of Criminology Division of Convict Criminology. Dr. Bolden also received the 2021 Distinguished Alumni Achievement Award from the College of Liberal Arts at Texas State University San Marcos, and the 2021 Faculty Senate Award for research from Loyola University, New Orleans. In 2012-2013, Dr. Bolden was the Futurist in Residence Research Fellow for the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. His areas of research are gang histories and processes, mass incarceration, human trafficking, and environmental criminology.
Okay, so essentially this panel was created to help engage more students outside of just STEM. So it is social sciences concentrated essentially. And we'll go ahead and get started with the questions. Oh, next. Okay. So discuss how efforts to support democracy and environmental protection have intersected and have produced constraints and possibilities for the sustainability and defense of these two goals. Dr. McClellan, what are your thoughts?
Well, so democracy is the least worst form of government humans have invented so far. And it has this mixed bag in relationship to environmental protection, especially in the United States. I think it works particularly well on local issues, but not so well on large-scale federal regulations. I'll say a little more about that in a second. I think it generally works best for issues that affect humans here and now, like point source pollution issues that affect human health, but it's not particularly good in addressing long-range problems. So for example, consider the 1964 to 1977 period for federal legislation. You get the Wilderness Act in 64, the National Environmental Policy Act in 69, which creates the EPA. In 1970, you get the Clean Air Act. 1972, the first Earth Day. 1973, the Endangered Species Act. 1977, the Clean Water Act. And that's pretty much it, all before I was born. There hasn't been much significant federal legislation since then. Notably, a lot of that was passed under Republican President Richard Nixon, back when there was a functioning Republican Party. That's true, people. So that basically occurred during the environmental movement, and 1969, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. So this was sort of a time where the environment was national attention, but that sort of has slipped. And yeah, we've seen a lot since then, but just in terms of national politics, I have a kind of a dim view about that, maybe international politics too. So I mean, the two largest environmental problems arguably are climate change and the current ongoing mass extinction event. And there's every sign that those have been getting worse. When did we first knew, let's see, I want to say, yeah, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed by the UN in 1988, and the Rio Summit for Biodiversity was 1992. So, basically pushing 30 to 40 years ago, this has been known as being major international problems, but they've only gotten worse, not begun to have been dealt with. So I'd just like to say a little bit about that. So what is it? So these are really global problems, and they're really long-term problems. But how does democracy work? Well, people vote to represent their vision of the good life, but also their interests. And what do politicians cater? Well, money and voters. So they're typically thinking in 2 to 4 year timelines. So the environment is always an important issue, but it's never the main issue. It's always after the economy. The environment's always something we'll deal with next year. But we've had a lot of next years, and we're still not there yet. So I like to think that it could be better, and I think it can be. One complicating feature is most modern democracies are capitalist, so there's a question of whether this is actually economic or governmental. But insofar as democracies are they're only consisted by actually existing people, not say future generations, we tend to have relatively proximate interests in terms of our timelines, and the environment doesn't really work that way. Curious to hear what the rest of you think about this. But, yeah, on that positive note.
I think I do have a little bit more of an optimistic perspective. First, I like to give the caveat. If you see bags under my eyes, it's because I got in from the Dominican Republic after 1 o'clock last night. I feel sorry for me. So hopefully I won't sound too discombobulated. It may be my optimism is because I'm coming to the environmental movement much later than my colleagues up here. But when I think about democracy and I think about these movements, I think about the history of people. And it's said that every 50 to 60 years there are pretty significant revolutions that change society really massively, doing things that nobody thought was possible. You had a system of slavery that was overthrown. You had civil rights. You had all of these things, segregation, restrictions against who people could marry. And all of these things seemed to be solid in society, but there was enough movement, enough will from the people to get those things changed. And I feel like we are at that point, we're at the tipping point. So two things that seem to be the biggest problems in our society, from my perspective, are climate change and mass incarceration. And I think we are at the tipping point in both of those, in which enough people have kind of woken up to that. You have celebrities making documentaries about it and getting the information out. So the issues have always been there, and I think one of the problems is most people just didn't recognize how severe things were, so they ignored it. But now it's coming to the point where half the people live on the coast, and so they're getting major climate problems, right, that they have to deal with. There's no way you can ignore it. I mean, just a few weeks ago, we had 1 day a week where we had severe things happening. That's unusual. There's no way to not recognize that, right? So I feel like the time is right, right? That there's enough critical mass that things can happen. Now there is this political seesaw, and we will have certain administrations who are very protective or sort of protective, and then we have certain administrations that strip away all those protections, right? So one thing is a democracy is supposed to be able to hold those individuals accountable. Whether we can do that or not, that remains to be seen. Those who are in my environmental criminology class, we just watched a very recent film about a case, Juliana versus the United States, which was kids, a group of kids who were suing the United States for contributing to climate change, knowingly, going all the way back to the 50s. And the fascinating thing about this case is it made it all the way up to the doorstep of the Supreme Court. And through that process, it covered all the complicity the U.S. government had in supporting the coal and oil and fossil fuel industry. And so now that information is readily available for people to see. That they didn't win the case, they kept being pushed back to some type of arbitration. But one thing that case did is it inspired kids from other countries to do the same thing. And those kids won their cases against their own governments. So all of these things kind of just give me hope, optimism that we are at that point where we can see actual and real change.
I want to go back to that 4-year increment type issue. It's been sort of the bane of our existence. I'm very proud that I live in a place that's democracy, and I think that it, in general, has worked well for us. But I do agree with Dr. Bolden about the changes. It took a long time to get through. I mean, I'm old enough that I lived through the 60s and frequently kind of go over a lot of things in my classes where we talk about the stress of the 60s. Where, women's rights were rising, civil rights were palpable, crimes were being committed against people who were trying to change those paradigms. Vietnam was raging, and the environment started becoming important to people. It was being verbalized. And those were tumultuous times, but they were times that almost built the foundation of all the things that we stand on now. And that we see all the progress and everything. And it's taken a lifetime, a career of people in my age cohort to get to the point where we can expect more change. But we will have more change. And that's been a very, very positive thing. Like Dr. McClellan said, there's really not a better model for government than what we have, except in theory. In theory, a lot of people have a lot of opinions on that. But if people stand up and use their rights, and especially if they vote, and please, one of the things that I harp on in my classes is about young people getting out and voting, being chronic voters. Because if you work in campaigns, as I have many times, what you find out, if you're knocking doors and you're talking to people about elections, using the information that anybody can buy about who lives in what house, how many people are voters, what percentage they vote, what parties they vote on, not how they vote, but all the information that backs up if a house is full of chronic voters. It's so rare that a 20-year-old comes to the door or a 24-year-old comes to the door. It's almost always old, gray-headed people who are the chronic voters. I sense that that's starting to change because of all of the issues that are being raised now that have to be solved by the government. But I do know that we have to have faith. We have to have the opinion that we can change things, and that we have to hold this democracy together. It's teetering right now. There's a lot of stuff that's very scary in the world right now, but I still think it's the best form of government. And we've got to figure out a way to get the United States back in a leadership position, not because we're the best at all, because we've committed so many crimes around the world, trying to build our economy and build our businesses and that sort of thing. But in general, we tend to come back to a great American value of volunteerism and giving of themselves to make a better world. And we've got to figure out a way to continue that.
Thank you for those responses. Moving to our next question. Environmental justice is defined by the EPA as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulation, and policies. Do you think this definition includes everything important? Should there be any additions or adjustments made to it? Can you think of ways that this definition is applied? Is it applied effectively? Dr. Bolden, what are your thoughts?
So this one kind of gets at a crossover between the things that I studied. And if I would add anything, it would be status. And what I'm thinking about is those that are incarcerated. Because we hear about a lot of the effects to other groups of people, but we don't really hear about what happens to those who are incarcerated. So I just want to give you an example. If any of you have heard of Dr. Andrea Armstrong from the law school, who advocates quite a bit for those who are incarcerated. One of the first people she really interacted with was Glenn Ford. And Glenn Ford was incarcerated for 30 years wrongfully. He was exonerated from death row. But within the year after he got out, he died of cancer. And that cancer was a direct result of the environmental conditions in Angola. And so we have situations where people live without climate control, without ventilation, where they have trash fires right outside of their cells, sludge from the backup sewers that they have to live in, so on and so forth. So these things are not discussed, they're not talked about, and there's actually a significant number of people who are incarcerated who die from illnesses directly related to the lack of environmental justice. Some of you may know, or you may not, all of these wildfires out in the West. We have a lot of prisoners who are actually out there fighting those fires, and people don't acknowledge or give credit for that. Here, when we have hurricanes, it's prisoners who are sandbagging, who are trying to protect different coastal areas. After Mardi Gras, it's prisoners who are cleaning up all of that trash on the street. So all of these things are not acknowledged. So there's that part. The part about applying everything, if the laws are applied justly, well, obviously, there's plenty of companies who kind of get away with destroying the environment, and they get slapped with the fine, but even when they get slapped with the fine, they'll fight their way out of that. You know, like the Exxon oil spill, you know, they start at 500 million and then just get it reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced till they're barely paying anything and paying it 20 years later. So there's not equal application of the law, right? And a lot of that has to do with the vested interests in industries, so that is very problematic. I actually could go on and on about this, but I want to go ahead and pass it to my colleagues.
I just want to point out that they asked a philosopher about a definition, so sort of be warned, there's a professional hazard here. So environmental justice, is the definition adequate? Well, I mean, no, of course not, as defined here. So one thing, it's a concept of legal justice. This is a trivial point, which at best captures part of what justice is, that which is codified in law. So I just want to make sort of two real points. The first is that this is with respect to sort of US law, so it doesn't really cover international law. So we now live basically in a globalized world, and we're no longer the primary manufacturing hub that we used to be. A lot of that has been outsourced, so there's been a sort of race to the bottom with respect to labor and environmental laws. So as long as we live in a world where we're sort of the beneficiaries of the products of objects made elsewhere, that can't be really a just world in general, or specific to the environment in particular. So I think that we would, and it does provide for that, but we would want to sort of create a network of environmental justice legislation, and probably, I mean, one idea is to impose protectionist trade sanction policies to correct for countries that don't have adequate environmental policies, to effectively tax them up to what it would be if they were to improve those laws, so that there's no reason for them not to improve and enforce their environmental policies. So that's sort of one area that I could see it standing in room of improvement. And now, I guess, the slightly more controversial point. Perhaps most interesting is that the EPA defines justice as the fair treatment of people. So in the US, the legal status of person applies to members of the species Homo sapiens, corporations, and ships. Those are the three things that can be legal persons. Not joking, look it up. But it excludes literally everything else, including all non-human animals, which are, strictly speaking, property or just natural goods, natural resources, if you will. There are special protections for marine mammals, endangered species, and that sort of thing. But by and large, animals and other parts of nature are things, not persons. So, I mean, for example, John Rawls says justice is owed to persons, and he says about animals that maybe not strict justice, or maybe there's no justice at all for animals. But I'll just point out that, for example, not all human beings are capable of forming a concept of justice, yet we think that we owe all humans justice regardless of their mental capacities. So insofar as we're talking about environmental justice, one would think that it would be justice towards the environment, but it's really what we have is justice towards other people with respect to the environment, which to me doesn't sound very just at all.
I yield to the philosopher in his definition of justice. But I will say this, that I remember when, through the 1980s, we mostly talked about environmental racism when we were referring to the things that this definition suggests. And I clearly remember that I had an activist friend who taught at Xavier. And he came back, I knew he'd gone to a meeting in Washington. And it was one of the, I think the first gathering of people of color. It was the basic name of the big meeting. And it was around 1990. And he came back and he called me and said, "Can I come out and talk to you? I'm really intrigued about what I just witnessed." And he came out to the Nature Center and he, it was like in The Graduate when they whispered plastics. He came out and said, "It's no longer racism, it's justice. We're seeking environmental justice." And he said, "It sounds like a simple change, but it's going away from having a connotation in people's minds that it's only about people of color. It's really about what's just for society." And that was really a major carnage turn in the discussion of these issues. And it really changed a lot of definitions. It changed, Bill Clinton put his executive order out on environmental justice, which was a monumental 2-page document that if y'all haven't read it, you should Google it and read it. Because that was the first time that it really was said that the U.S. government will not violate environmental justice in our society. And it had such a monumental change because all of a sudden every agency in government had to have a section that dealt with environmental justice. And thousands of people found really good jobs to go into different areas of government because everybody had to hire people who focused on environmental justice. And as soon as you had that law, literally, when people started looking for justice, they found injustice. And it started just a tsunami of change in the way regulations were promulgated and enforced, and really opened the door to something that had been opening itself for a decade, starting in the 70s. When, at the end of the 60s is when things started to change with all the laws that have been mentioned and all the agencies and things like that. But going into the 90s is when it had matured to the point where we started speaking a different language and looking at it from a different perspective. Sort of a more mature perspective, I think, in the discussion. So I think that that's probably relevant to this particular question. We'll get to it a little bit more in an upcoming question.
Thank you so much. So we've just discussed a bit about the definition of environmental justice, discussed how and why environmental issues are inseparable from social issues, and how social justice concerns have been articulated through the environmental justice movement. Dr. Bob, would you like to continue?
Yeah, well, you know, it's something that, I mean, we are humans. We do have interactions. There are nearly 8 billion of us. We'll soon pass that marker to 8 billion. Compare that if you go back in time. When I was born, that's what I always tell my students. I always start every one of my classes looking at the exponential growth curve of humans. And I always tell the same story. That when I was born, there were 2 billion people on Earth. And when I was studying biology as an undergraduate, I started thinking about that number and what was it like for my parents. Well, my mother was 18 when I was born. So when I looked at how many people were there when she was born, 2 billion. You know, it just a different level in the 2 billion. But I look back at my grandparents who were born in the 1890s and 1880s. And they were born into a world that was 1+ billion. So it basically doubled from them to me. And so then, for years, I talked about what would it be like when I have grandchildren. You know, from my grandparents to me, it doubled. What's it going to do for me to my grandchildren? And it tripled. You know, there was 6 billion when my teenage grandchildren were born. And then it had already gone to 7 billion when my younger set, my last set of grandchildren were born. And these things have had huge impacts. And that's why you can't separate social issues from environmental issues. Because as I like to say, if we didn't have the human population that we have today, we wouldn't have environmental issues at the level that we have. But it's because we've developed, not only we've gone up more than triple when I was born, but we have higher technology. Artificial intelligence is rising at a rapid clip, and we're more consumptive. We're very much more consumptive. And we haven't quite gotten around it. I mean, our democracy hadn't handled, you know, we talked about how the United States has contributed to climate change. We've also contributed to the world trash issue with plastics and things like that. And so you cannot separate the two. If you want to have justice, you've got to consider what human needs are. In Louisiana, we're facing one of those right now. We're sort of at the epicenter of that when we're talking about how we're going to save coastal Louisiana. Well, first of all, everybody knows we're not going to save coastal Louisiana the way it was when I was y'all's age. What we're trying to do is we're trying to save the values and to live with the changes that have been wrought in the way we've lived in this world. And the things that we can't control. I mean, we cannot control sea level rise. It's too late to control climate change to the level where there'll be no sea level rise. And we're very concerned about what's happening in Antarctica now. You know, we lost another major shelf just a few weeks ago. And the prognosis was that if it goes to its extreme of what happens, it could raise sea level worldwide by 165 feet. Well, simply imagine that for a moment. Sea level coming up 165 feet. Because where does 90% of the world's population live? Right along the edge of the coast. So this would bring incredible social change to the way we live in the world. But that's why you can't separate them, and that's why humans are such a driving force. And we've got to figure out a way to maintain our humanity and the things that we appreciate, while at the same time conserving the values of the world for future generations. And that's what we preach about in my classes, and I'm sure the classes of these two professors and other classes you're taking on the Jesuit campus, we're all very concerned about that. How do we do it? And to even talk about separating the two is fine, because we can't. It drives me crazy in Louisiana when we talk about, I am very much in favor of some of these major projects that are going to help control the future of the edge of the coast. But it drives me nuts when the government, the state government, the federal government, are talking about plans that are going to alter the culture of people who have lived for generations and generations and generations on our coast. It's going to change the way those cultures work. And there are no adjustments being made. I mean, I think you can do everything that we need to do technologically, and we can conserve cultures and ways of life if the government suggests the way Clinton did with environmental justice. If somebody mandates that we have to make that a primary concern in our planning for the future.
So, environmental justice, of course, you cannot separate the issues. This question takes me back to this concept that was brought up, the difference between the words of environmental justice and environmental racism. And during that process, during that discussion, all the things that were learned, the things that we know from that. We know that minority communities suffer disproportionate impacts from environmental hazards. We know that in Washington, D.C., the Potomac River, which goes through wealthy neighborhoods and tourist areas, is kept as pristine as possible. The Anacostia River, which goes through minority neighborhoods, is just filled with pollution, and there's virtually no effort to clean that up. We know that the California Waste Management Board in the 1980s did a study to determine where they could place facilities that produced hazardous waste without a problem, and they determined they could place them next to minority neighborhoods because those minority neighborhoods were less likely to create NIMBYs, the not in my backyard groups, to protest them, and it would be a double-edged sword by providing opportunities for work. Doesn't matter if people are going to get cancer 15, 20 years down the line, right? So we know all of those things. We know that people who have less income likely have to go to areas with older structures, right? Older structures in which there's lead paint, older structures in which the materials are still made of asbestos. And so those people with lower socioeconomic status are growing up with all of these pollutants in their system, right? So there's this obvious aspect of extreme environmental injustice, really. Thinking about this question, though, I'm influenced by what I heard earlier by Dr. McClellan, and I'm actually sitting here just being really disturbed because also what Dr. Bob was saying, I was thinking about growing up and how the concept of animal extinction was just so bizarre and unreal. And now humans have become the toxins, and we are just wiping animal species off the earth at such an extreme rate. And there's obvious impacts that are going to just be pervasive amongst all of society. And so I'm just kind of digesting all of that. You know, in my class, we've gone over the animals that have disappeared in the last 10 years, and it's just unimaginable, right, that all of these things were occurring. So, how do we address that? I guess that's the next question, so I don't want to jump too far. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McClellan.
You started with when you were born. So I was born in '78. So one relevant fact there, just speaking about, you're talking about biodiversity, just since 1978 until basically now, I think the year of the study was 2018 or 2019, not species, just the number of vertebrate animals has been reduced by half. So there's a pretty direct correlation between human population increase and both extinction and just population decline. We started to learn more about the same happening with insects, but it's just physically quieter at nights relative to when I was a child. So the forests are just sort of more empty than they used to be. To maybe make the point a little more concretely, the population of human beings in Metro New Orleans is greater than the population of giraffes on the planet now. So we think of them as, long-necked horses from Africa. But yeah, they're quite rare these days. So onto the specific question, I kind of want to tie back to the previous question just to show that I wasn't, head in the clouds philosopher talking definitions to connect it with real-world environmental racism. So yeah, the Bill Clinton's 1994 Executive Act was a big deal. But if we think about, the Civil Rights Act of '64, we've got the Fair Housing Act. There was a lot of concrete legislation. It took 30 years to get something specific on environmental justice, and it's still the status of an executive order. There's still not federal legislation on environmental justice, and that's a problem in terms of making it materially real and taken more seriously, because it's under the EPA and they do an annual report, but they don't have kind of budget, no real enforcement mechanism like they should if it were an actual law. All 50 states do now have it, and environmental justice, I think, is improving since the 90s. I'm not sure if anybody followed the local news, but earlier this month, the $75 million settlement for residents of Gordon Plaza and the Bolden Elementary School. Basically, it's a local community built on top of the former Agriculture Street landfill. This is like dumped going back more than 100 years that prior to the existence of environmental legislation. So basically, any number of hazardous materials that wouldn't be permissible to dump today are present there. So what do you think is going to happen when you build housing and an elementary school on top? What we expect reasonably to happen is what happened. So yeah, there's definitely lots of issues with respect to even correcting for level of socioeconomic development, so just along race lines. It's definitely the case that across sort of all measurables, like infant mortality, life expectancy, but including environmental load with respect to toxic exposure, it's not fair, it's not just, but it has gotten better over the last 20, nearly 30 years now, I guess. But I think, and it's constantly been discussed, I think it sort of says something, because voting is sort of, that's something that's concrete measurable, but environmental justice is sort of everything around us. That's a lot harder to hold people accountable, so there's probably a reason why that's the one that hasn't gotten the same level of legislative protection as the others.
I would argue that maybe the thing that's holding them back is corporate power.
Yep.
And I mean, I'm not a person that runs around screaming negative things about corporations. I mean, they make our life a lot better, but the thing is that they're so powerful. And they, up and down the river, I tell my students all the time, I say, today when a new chemical company is trying to locate on this river, they're located there because of transportation, because of cheaper energy, because of the river, because of other companies that they can buy byproduct from in their manufacturing. There's all these reasons. And if one of them is so stupid that they say, let's go down there because there's a lot of poor people and we can push our weight around, that's just stupidity. Because look what's happening with Formosa. I mean, they may well fail, just like Shintech did. Shintech failed until they moved up to Plaquemine, which was a chemical-friendly city. And they started out small on a campus, and then they expanded. Now they're building another chemical plant there. But when they first came in, they just talked about jobs that would never exist with the local people. And they didn't use the right approach to it. But there was a time, there's no doubt about it, when they were building plants because the people could not fight them. There's no doubt about that. But if they think that's going to happen now, they're just poorly informed, I think.
Moving to the next question. As everyone knows, this panel was essentially created to engage students that may not be familiar with the STEM-centered interests that typically run the environmental and sustainability areas. What would y'all define as the role of students, and how do you see us proactively addressing these issues?
No,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so obviously learn everything you can in your classes, but don't sort of wait until you know everything to act. I think I'll say just maybe very little bit about this. So one thing about environmental justice specifically is environmental justice issues. It's a sort of movement, but it's grassroots, and it tends to be sort of mosaic of local-based issues. So as simple as like a particular plant in a community, it's some kind of local problem. That's where an environmental justice group comes from. And I tend to think that that's, despite what I said about my dim view of democracy, that was mostly with respect to federal in a country of greater than 300 million people. But locally, I think the environmental justice movement can do quite a bit because you have to mobilize relatively fewer people, and it only takes a couple of people that are well organized to effect change. So I think environmental justice is probably a more reasonable area for optimism than something like traditional issues-based environmental change, things like climate change or biodiversity loss. Like that's awfully big issue, hard to tackle. But some local groups like the Louisiana Bucket Brigade, Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, bunches of grassroots community gardening projects, rain barrel collection, anything having to do with water mitigation and recovery is obviously a big help around here. And yeah, so lots of opportunities to get your feet literally wet around here. So.
You know what's great is if y'all speak from the heart in your classes. When we talk about issues that don't make sense to you, that you don't understand how we got to where we are, it's really great to have somebody not feel like I have to have a technical solution as much as I need to speak how I feel about this at this point in my life. Because believe me, you will feel differently as you go through life. It's one of the strange things about aging is you get more experience and you change your views on it. Doesn't mean you change your passions. Doesn't mean that you take your eye off the big picture issues that were important to you at this age. But it means that you speak out because it's going to resonate with other people in your class. Even if they don't say anything, you may have just started a spark of thought in a classmate who still will not speak about it, but now will start to consider it and maybe act on it, maybe do volunteerism, maybe put people together. So to me, that's one of the most important things about the way y'all need to react. Remember, you're in the Gen Z group. Let me ask you this, have any of you read 21 Issues for the 21st Century? Anybody? All right, I start all my classes the last 2 years with a slideshow about that. Because what they basically say is that your generation is going to be so different in your workforce. And it's not because of just where you're entering. It's because of the rapid change in artificial intelligence is going to dominate the work career. And he basically says that if you are not able to adjust, radically adjust your career direction every 5 years, it's going to be extremely difficult for you. And it's not a scary book. It's a very thought-provoking book. And I would suggest that y'all get a copy of it. And if nothing else, get on your computers and put in Noah Harari. And YouTubes are going to pop up and appearances on 60 Minutes and things like that. Watch it. Get a flavor for it. And then eventually read the book, because it's going to have everything to do with the next 50 years of your life, which is really, really important. I mean, your generation is primed to take off and solve a lot of the issues that we've not been able to solve in my generation. You're right there at the edge. Things are going to change rapidly, and medicine is changing at warp speed. So people will live longer and healthier, and we're going to solve a lot of our medical problems. But that's going to allow you to do more and more and more. And I don't say that to put pressure on you. It's going to be fun. I mean, that's my main regret of being my age at this point in history, is that I'm not gonna get to see what you guys are gonna do. Unless I'm really gonna be sitting someplace where I can watch it, which might be kinda cool too.
I like that transition point because I have a lot of faith and hope in your generation. I think generational differences, the older generations, we grew up with limited perspectives. That's just the way things were. We grew up sometimes not knowing much outside of where it was that we lived. And so that kind of restricted our imagination, if you will. Whereas the world of information is open to you. And you grew up with access to that. And speaking of that connection, you can be connected worldwide. And that is pretty impressive. Once young people decide to do things, sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's out of the blue. Let me just give you an example, like during the election when the TikTokers decided to tank Trump's rally. Who would have thought of that? I don't understand who came up with that, right? But everybody got on board to do that. You have that power and ability to get things done when you put your mind to it. And you have this ability to think outside of these restrictive boxes that a lot of the older generations grew up with, right? You have this power of unlimited imagination. Each individual can do something. I mean, there was just this recent situation where one college student in Michigan noticed that on a particular road, salamanders were being destroyed at a massive rate, and did a research project on that. Published that research project, and the local community, the government decided to close the road during that time when those salamanders migrated over. It was just one thing, one research project, right? So one person can make a very significant difference. I'm always impressed with what the imagination comes up with. In some of my classes, we talk about things that have been invented by the youth, right? You had a 17-year-old invent something to deal with the garbage patches in the ocean. That's pretty impressive. You've got kids who invented the ability to charge your phone through kicking a soccer ball, which, who would have thought of that, right? So what I want to say to that is our role is to present as much knowledge to you as possible and to teach how to ask questions and how to look for answers, right? But our hope, our faith, is for you to take that and run with it in whatever way possible. Don't limit yourself. Don't limit your imagination. I think other things contributed to possibilities, one being the pandemic and a lot of people waking up to the realization that they don't want to do things that are not meaningful, right? So take that and run with it. That's your role.
Thank you so much. That's quite inspiring to hear from a bunch of scholars, for sure, just because, I don't know, I feel like I often reflect on, am I actually making a difference? But anyway, that's besides the point. Does anyone in the audience have any questions for our panelists?
I do, actually.
Yes, absolutely. Would you like to step up to the mic? Sure. Fantastic.
I have a lot of questions, but I'm actually just going to limit myself to, I guess, to two big themes. So my first question is for all of you, actually. Before you continue, will you make sure it's on? Is it on YouTube? I think they're just a couple. It's the, okay, I think we just have it. Yeah, I don't know if it's on. Sorry.
Hello.
I don't know. That's If you're just gonna stand up and like that. Yeah, sure. No problem. Okay, so as I was saying, I have two major questions, but the first one is for all of you. I guess I just want to preface this with, I see in the media currently that a lot of fear, in people's fear, is being used, specifically like climate anxiety. And I personally believe that in our generation, this method is being used to promote inaction. And I see climate doomism specifically as a plague that's starting to grow amongst my generation. And all three of you have mentioned that you're very hopeful and you're very optimistic. And I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on climate doomism, and how do you think climate doomism could impact sustainable solutions potentially? So, yeah.
I'll comment on that. And I think that's going to be a driving force for your generation, because it weighs heavily on you, and people will be focusing on it, as we are. I mean, we hear about it every day in the news. But what we mostly hear is people blaming something on climate change, and that's what drives the boom. So what's going to happen is that your generation is going to be well equipped to start incrementally addressing those issues. And once it gets rolling, it's going to be like a snowball rolling down the hill. And I think it'll be one of the main driving forces of your generation, because it's obviously something that can't be tolerated. It's got to be addressed, and y'all have the wherewithal to do it. You've got the skills. You've never not known Google. You've never not known the sources of information. And you go back to my grandparents' generation, and somebody said one time that you look at the Sunday New York Times, it's about that thick, and in 1900, that was about the total knowledge that humans held. Total knowledge. One Sunday newspaper, the amount of information that's in there. And look what is available to y'all. Everything. And so the more you can learn how to access that and turn it into action, the better you'll be. And you're in a perfect university for doing that, because action is one of the key cornerstones of the Jesuit education. So I'm really enthused about it.
I'll co-sign that. Yeah, absolutely. So climate doomism, it's definitely there. And, I love sci-fi movies, I love video games, and I really love apocalyptic things. And just about everyone is because of a climate disaster, right? And so that reinforcement of that idea isn't helpful, right? So I recognize that. All of that being said, I do want to reiterate what I was saying earlier about being hopeful, especially for your generation. Society is a social construct, right? It is what we make it, right? What we've seen over and over again is societal changes, miracles happening, right? I see that day to day. And I really do mean that. Me sitting here is a situation nobody believed was possible, because I was a gang member who went to prison, and then I got out, got a PhD, did work for the FBI, and now people who are serving life in prison without the possibility of parole are getting that possibility and getting out. So these are things that people didn't believe could happen. And so humans are literally magical. They can change the world, right? Recognition of believing or believing that they can do so is key to that. On a small scale, I was so excited just to hear about there being a sustainability committee for the SGA, right? Because that's a starting point, right? And I'm thinking about one of my alma maters, I don't know if we do here, but there, the students were concerned about the environment, and then they came up with ideas that the school started implementing, like reusing the cooking oil for the lawn equipment, right? They just kept coming up with ideas, and the school would allow it to happen, right? On a grander scale, I mentioned that case, Juliana versus the United States. These were 8 kids. They weren't even college students. They were kids, right, that sued the United States and went all the way up through every court of law, right, winning a lot. Now, one of the things that may have come from that, I'm not sure if that was the direct thing, but the U.S. military, which is the largest carbon emitter, has come up with a plan to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Whether they can do that or not, who knows? But nobody would have ever thought the U.S. military would even be interested in doing that, right? So things can happen. And I guess it's, just encouraging each other, like reminding each other that things are possible.
Yeah, and if I came across as optimistic, I apologize. That wasn't my intention. I'm being partly serious, but also partly joking. So Stephanie mentioned the question, whether what I'm doing matters. I want to kind of address that because I think it's going to get worse, and I think it's going to get significantly worse before it gets better. If anybody pay attention to the latest IPCC group report released last Monday, the UN Secretary General came out and called the world leaders liars publicly. This hasn't happened before. The language is stronger, that we are on a path to a lifeless planet, he said. We're not going to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. That ship has already sailed effectively. We're probably not going to meet the 2 degrees Celsius target. But how much worse it gets beyond that is, I think, significantly up to us, especially younger generations. So with respect to does what I do matter? It might not. So let me just be a little bit cautious about what I'm saying here. So philosophers have talked about this a lot, the so-called causal inefficacy problem. If me doing something versus not doing something doesn't have a material effect in the net results, like giving up meat, if it doesn't shut down the factory farms, does it matter that you do or don't eat meat? Because one line of thought is, if it doesn't actually change materially the system, then what you do doesn't matter. But I think maybe here's me being optimistic, a more constructive way to think about it is, it's not about whether what you do matters in terms of its effects, but it matters what you do, I think, mostly in terms of, in response to the question, like, when the chips were down in this sort of situation, what was it that you stood for? I think that's kind of the right way to think about that question, not in terms of the effects of whether there was a specific consequence that you intended to happen and in fact happened. Because let me tell you, as somebody who's worked in activism, there's quite a lot of failures along with the successes. You just have to accept that. But it doesn't mean it's not worth trying.
I also have another question for you specifically. I believe your name is Dr. Bolden, correct? So, Dr. Bob. Okay. I am an enrolled member of Louisiana's state-recognized tribe within Choctaw. And whenever you spoke about the coastline and the Louisiana's plan specifically, it reminded me of a presentation that we had earlier in the semester on the governor's office specific climate action plan. And I went to a dinner after, and I was disappointed to learn that there is talk about not including the state-recognized tribes here in Louisiana in that action plan. And so what you said I found to be really, really interesting, because I believe that the state tribes here are the backbone of much of Louisiana, and even here in Wauwachia, or as most of you know, New Orleans. And without these tribes, without Homa Nation, without Al Jean-Charles, without the Grand Caillou Dulac man, I don't believe that there would be the culture that we have here in Louisiana and New Orleans. And so I was wondering, since you seem to know a good bit about the governor's plan, is what steps you think that we could take in order to include these tribes to help maintain their culture in a world where climate change will soon not allow them to maintain their traditional lifestyles. So if you could speak on that, great. If not, I know it's kind of a big question.
No, I think it's going to take action that involves a lot of communication. And because you're absolutely right, I think when we talk about injustice, I mean, the Native American cultures have been at the brunt of it for the longest time. And we've got to change the way we look at that. And of course, your culture is the one that's most endangered because you're losing tribal lands. You're losing. I know how your spirituality, how Native Americans feel about their ancestors, where they're buried, and how that is sacred land in their culture. And that's something that's definitely going to disappear. And I know that's Pointe-au-Chien and all the neighborhoods down there, that's their biggest concern, is what's going to happen to the tribal lands. And America has a tradition of just not caring about tribal lands. I mean, it goes all the way back from when we first landed on the East Coast. But I think what you all need to do, and maybe it's something you could spearhead as a student activist and let it spread among the universities, is to get people who are Native Americans together and link in with all the other groups that are also fighting for their heritage and start a revolution in the state that focuses on protecting the future for the cultures. Because for God's sake, if you can't convince Louisianians that culture's important, then you're not going to convince anybody. I mean, we revel in our gumbo cultures. We revel in how amalgamated all of our cultures have become and how it has created this sweet way of life that we all adore. And there's got to be a way to link that together. And the only way to do it is somebody's got to begin the conversation and begin uniting, strategically uniting different groups of people that traditionally are fighting their own battles and bring them together. And because you're absolutely correct, it's going to really change the future of Native American cultures in our state. Because y'all are lined up along the coast. But also spotty all over the state. A lot of people don't realize that, how strong the Native American culture is. I've been to many powwows and learned an awful lot having people at our nature center teaching spiritual values of Native Americans. So I really think that's a powerful, powerful movement that could be started. But it's going to take that. It's going to be political. You got to get political power, at least political attention. You don't have the power. You have the attention so that they understand that this is a force to be reckoned with. That's really important.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other audience questions? To one or all?
Yeah. And could you remind me of your name?
My name is Cynthia.
Okay. Hi, Cynthia. Thank you for your question. I know it wasn't directed at me. Last semester I did actually work in the governor's office of coastal activities, and they were the main policy shop working on Louisiana's climate action plan. And I found your question really interesting just because I had the chance to work with, and I'm forgetting her title, which Sherelle Barkley.
I believe she's the new, she might be the new head of the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs. It used to be Panama.
Okay, And yeah, just to mention that, I bring her up just to say it's like, the best way to, get that change and to make sure those communities are included is by showing up to those public meetings, into those town halls, into things of that manner, because that's when so many of those important decision-making folks are there. Like, whenever you see CPRA hosting their public comment meetings, or if there's the meetings for these big projects that are going to, somehow impact tribal lands and those vulnerable communities, it's important to show up there, because that's why they're there. And all of those public comments, while at times they may not take them and, actually engage with them, it makes a sort of legal record for it. It's like you're on record saying this and you're putting your community in the spotlight to say, okay, we showed up. How can we link with other groups that are saying and doing these same works that are going to establish co-benefits for my community? That's it.
Any questions? Okay, cool. So other than that, something else that you can do is fill out the Green Fund survey. So this is part of the Sga Sustainability Committee's initiatives. This was actually brought up by past SGA. So essentially, it is on an opt-in basis. We're hoping to get this implemented soon, assuming that we get hit our sample size. So I'm pretty sure a lot of you have already done it. But with that, if you're feeling especially inspired, we also have a Green Fund scholarship, which will be awarded at the end of this week. There will be 2 winners for $500, and the application is live on How Connect until midnight. But yes, if you have any questions, you can totally reach out to me. Those are kind of just some ideas on how you can get started.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Also for the Green Fund, if y'all have already participated in the survey, please make your friends do it. We're real close to our sample size. For the professors here, please send it out to your students,
We're
get
like
them to-
100 away.
Again, like we're so close. We are so close.
So that's kind of what the Sga Sustainability Committee has done alongside helping fund the bioswale and getting a resolution of student support for that. But if you guys have ideas, please bring them forward to us. It's the end of the year, but there's lots to do, and we could use all the support and all the input. But yeah, thank you so much for coming. I hope you learned something. I definitely did. I even had each of their classes, and I'm still learning, always learning. Very exciting to always hear from them. But yeah, I hope you have a good rest of your evening, and I don't know, don't be shy. Go to all the Earth events.
Yeah.
And thanks for joining us.
Look, it was a great practice for.
You never know.
Green Fund.
If you're writing something for the learning, maybe you could put something about the Green Fund in the learning.
Actually, good idea.
No promises, I'll share that.
I said that to you a while ago.
Yay.
Because we are so close.
Like we were talking about, also, like, you know how the tornado happened?
Yeah,
I live
rather than
down
singing.
there. We are right here. I don't live in
Yeah.
Area, but I live like 5
Then
minutes
hopefully
away.
by, I think,
And so,
maybe
like,
the fall.
Thanks for coming. Have fun.
Take popcorn to go, y'all. Please.
He's the.
Oh yeah, it's all the popcorn.
Like photographer. And he's talking
Yeah.
about. Yeah, I don't know, yeah. And like, he was talking about how like the city, like how like media runs around the city and how like these like other places don't get any coverage. So it's like hard, like especially since it's in the Desert Alley. My dad
I guess I can tell too if my son
refinery and
is
stuff like that. And, like,
Yeah.
well, I will be nice.
yeah, thank you.
Just that
Jen's
you're
writing
already-
that.
Of course you did.
She told me, I told her.
Definitely for the question you said, follow the CPRA LinkedIn and Instagram.
Yeah.
They're always posting latest public meetings. The Green Fund It's actually, if you go into your email and just search green fund, SLM has been sent out all those emails.
I also appreciate your answer.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll take
so-
that course.
Yeah, y'all refill your water bottles too.
That was awesome.
Have you met?
Yeah, so I'm going to work. I'll be right down there. Yeah, because they have time and I do want to work in the I was thinking about Oregon. Are you from here? Yeah, that's what I want, but it's so far. And do you want to stay? And then I want to stay in Oregon, and then I'm like, possibly.
That's the thing with Causal, like I actually, that's why I've actually started looking now. And I'm just like, where do I want to stay? I gotta like pick a place.
I wanted to leave in Florida, and then now I've got 11 hours where I spend like 5 hours cleaning ocean. So
Yeah.
it's like,
I mean, like, the same, but also like, I'd rather do that than stay in Maryland. DC is fine, Maryland?
Yeah, but don't stress yourselves out about don't.
That's a lot of
Well, oh, well, maybe you need to stress. Yeah, I have one friend that's like, oh, med school training, like, you want to strong because I refuse. I absolutely refuse. Yeah. Yeah, but don't stress out, don't speak it. It's rough, but it's like, I do, so I'm gonna for maybe like a decade and a half, but I really want to work in policy or public policy areas. All of the